Welcome to one of our final Black History Month events. My name is Harriet Tubman. I'm the Black Community Initiative Coordinator at the University of Denver. And today we have the honor of having Dr. Ousmane Power-Greene, who is an Associate Professor of History in the Department and the Director of Africana Studies at Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts. He's completed his BA from the University of North Carolina. We talked about that, the Tar Heels, Chapel Hill, and an MED and MA and his PhD from the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, as well as an MFA from Columbia University in fiction programs. As a creative writer, Ousmane's poetry, short stories, and novels focus on African American experiences in contemporary America. Professor Greene has a book entitled Against Wind and Tide, the African American Struggle Against Colonization Movements. And he's also a co-author of the book In Search of Liberty, 19th Century African American Internationalism. And he has another book that I'll let him share with you that he's been working on for a couple of years. I was pretty excited about the BLM movement. And so today, the movement of our times, arts and activism, Dr. Ousmane.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Make sure, I can take my mask off, okay? I don't get to see my face. I've gotten so used to teaching with the mask on everybody that I'm gonna have to adjust back to the days of not having a mask. I'm so happy you all came out today. For me to share this work, those streaming online. I've been involved with researching and writing about African American history for at least 20 years, and the past about a decade or so, I've been very interested in the ways in which art, visual art, monuments, and memorials has functioned to sort of engage people in questions about the past and also getting them thinking about interpretations of these events. And so what I am going to share with you today comes from my travels abroad and my efforts to really try to contextualize African American social political movements. I'm going to start here, go on to there, and then we'll hopefully have time to ask questions and see about some of these experiences. Before I do that, first I should thank Ms. Jordan Fields for I was joking when she reached out to me in August and I said, me at Clark, we got to get our act together like that, right? To plan in advance before February. And so I really appreciate the invitation. And then of course, Coach Woods and others who I met today was wonderful and has shown me at least a place that hopefully I'll be back again because it really has been wonderful so far. Even the snow, which I'm from Western Mass, so that ain't nothing to me. So when in 2011, Martin Luther King Monument in Washington was unveiled to the public, some people hailed it as an example of America's progress from the days of segregation to the election of a black president of the United States, Barack Obama standing near the monument in the image that's on the screen. Although King was the first African American immortalized in the mall, urban centers throughout the nation and world have long celebrated King and other black freedom fighters such as Rosa Parks, Frederick Douglass, and Sojourner Truth through monuments, murals, and memorials. Memorialization, in the eyes of many, provide communities with visual markers that narrate black Americans' triumph over racial inequality and also to inspire oppressed people over the world, from Belfast, Northern Ireland, which we're going to get into, to Rome, Italy, where I just came from, in order to fight against racial and ethnic injustice. Yet some critics contend that monuments and memorials are not enough to change the historical and structural causes and consequences of racist policies and practices. So this talk is based on my research, as I mentioned, in international travel, and explores the role of black social and political movements, and also on the global struggle for human rights and against racial inequality, from the Abolition Movement to Black Lives Matter movement, which I'm really excited to share with you. I'm also actually interested in the limitations of visual markers in order to serve national narrative. And that's part of the reason I put this up on the screen. You can look, if you've been to DC in the mall, right, there is sort of these different monuments and memorials, but each one, even the Vietnam Memorial and others, were sites of contestation. In other words, some people had one view about how to represent it, others had other views, but the goal is eventually they become a part of the national narrative and the story, and you just go and you see these figures, and now you see King. How many people have been to the Washington, the mall? Have people seen the King statue? Yeah, I wanted to get an image of it in proportion, because actually it's not, you could tell right there that it's not all that large, relatively speaking, but it is something to behold. All right, so I mentioned my trip. So last week at this time, literally, I was giving a talk in Rome, Italy, at the American Academy in Rome. I was invited out to participate in a conference on political violence. Many people are often surprised that even in Italy, in Rome, other places we're going to look at, African American experience is something that has been inspirational to activists all over the world. This particular conference, as you could tell by the title, was conceived and conceptualized after the events of last year, right, in terms of the Capitol, and putting the events in D.C. last year within the context of fascist movements and other movements to take over things. So that's why Marla Stone, who's the director there, came up with the idea of the conference, and we were working on an edited collection together where I presented a piece about Black Americans' response to fascism in the 60s and 70s, and so that's how she invited me out. Now, when I was in Rome, like everywhere I go, I'm eager to find examples of African American social political movements. I had a great opportunity to speak with graduate students who actually said that, talked a bit about the struggle, which I was able to find around street murals in Rome specifically. And actually, they pointed out that in Florence and Milan is really where Black Lives Matter movement is really kicked off in Italy. And this goes back for a long tradition. However, despite efforts by state officials to sort of manage, let's call it manage, right, the sort of activism and, through preventing maybe, a mural like this that's very prominent, athletes, footballers for the team still decided to represent, right? And so you see these sort of various representations, even when perhaps in political ways that doesn't happen, right? As I mentioned, in places like Milan, this is a particularly fascinating sort of image. We notice when we look at this image, some of us can read immediately several things happening. I don't know if we have any art historians or in the room, but even if you're not, you notice immediately over here on the screen. Oh, I'm fast forwarding it. No, go back. Okay, hold on. There we go. I got to get the right pointers right. But we see, all right, I'm not going to be able to get it right. Obviously, right, the Ku Klux Klan member being represented with the Statue of Liberty, right? That's a powerful statement right there for the street artist, right, to do that pairing. My paper I presented there was actually about anti-Klan activism in New York in the 70s, right? And so when I saw this, I was like, I got to put this on, right? Because it shows you how even organizations like the Ku Klux Klan internationally are represented as being sort of the epitome of racist sort of, or we look at racism and fascism, right? Two sides of one coin representing that. And so imagine being in Milan, walking down as an American and seeing that wall art. Just stop your chest, like, all of a sudden, then we don't even get into Bart Simpson is black or whatever. Like, there's so much happening, right? This is in Naples in Italy. A lot happening in terms of this sort of, this roof art in this case, right? George Floyd, which kicked off so much of this, right, becomes placed in the pantheon, right, of leaders that are respected. Angela Davis over here we may not recognize Americans Vladimir Lenin on the left side, right? But Lenin, for those Marxist socialist radicals in Italy, all across the world, despite Stalin, Lenin still continues to be a figure of inspiration. Even King finds his way in, of course, juxtaposed by Malcolm X, which I gave a talk once at Clark about Martin Luther King's radicalism and getting into the sort of image, the contrast. I think we got to challenge that. But nevertheless, it's fascinating how we see the representations in the artists' minds pulling together these different strands, right, into one image that people are going to interact with outside the textbooks or history books, right? And it's part of the reason I'm so interested. Now, for those that aren't aware, part of what makes Rome such an exciting place to visit, if you all go visit, is that unlike the sort of, unlike the, an art gallery, for example, where you would go and see different images, even graffiti nowadays, Rome is almost in and of itself a walking art gallery. It's like got the, all the different pieces that are left and sort of put from long ago. But also when you go inside the churches, this was something that was very important, to the various popes, was putting very important artistic pieces on the walls, right? And so some of the most, as I learned when I'm being guided around by these art historian folk, we went on a tour, when you walk around, you see these huge murals and paintings that are attempting to capture, to hold in place the experiences of people. Now, I was told, and this is actually an image from a church that has perhaps one of the most influential Caravaggio Baroque image, and they were telling me, I was so fascinated by this because this is an image of me being actually inside that painting, but people have to come from all around the world to actually see an authentic picture because you can't take it off the wall and put it in some gallery, right? And so I was fascinated by that because it really does pair a different sojourn for people like me going to say, we're going to talk about this, different famous murals like in Belfast and Fall River Road, where for us, for those that study social movements, we seek out, not stuff like this, but we're seeking out those other experiences. But I found it to be fascinating. They were telling me, the art historians, that it was ordinary people in his paintings that made it so important. Ordinary people. So these images are of oil. He finds people on the street to use their pictures, not the idealized pictures. And also the light, which I thought was fascinating. So now, I have actually been to conferences. I went to one in Mainz, Germany, which is here in this image, specifically bringing scholars together, talking about this question of, as you can see, abolition movement to Black Lives Matter, right? So this pairing that I'm talking about is actually a part of a global conversation, thinking about the past, considering the ways in which the abolition movement against slavery becomes like the major human rights movement of the 19th century, and those images of figures from that era, Frederick Douglass, for example, Sojourner Truth, and others, are the sort of intellectual landscape of the world, actually, right, all throughout, and I keep seeking them out. So we're going to talk about some of these images. Now, specifically, the idea of a monument to something and having that being the center of contestation gets at some bigger question and issue that I brought up, which is about memory and history. Memory and history, right? How do people remember the past, right? How do historians write about the past, okay? Now, historians this is from the image of the Robert E. Lee statue in Charlottesville, University of Virginia, right? Historians, are pretty unified as far as it goes around the role of slavery in the Civil War, for example, right? It's not really a debate, right? Historians now argue that slavery, enslavement of Black people in America was central to the war, right? However, other parts of, outside the academy, this is a hotly contested issue. highly contested. Some of us may know from their lived experience in school, for example. I have students who live in Worcester, Massachusetts, were still taught that it was states' rights that was the major cause, not slavery. And I'm like, that's states' right? I'm at 40 years old. No, look, historians never agree on everything. However, you get like 85, 90%. And that's basically like everybody, right? There's still 10%, but the majority. And this is part of what led to the Unite the Right rally, right? Which was a counter-protest to taking down the statue, right? So uniting the right, white supremacists and others, and fellow travelers, to contest the taking down the statue. Some of them weren't even from the community, right? But they come to contest over what they see as a challenge to how they want to remember the past and romanticize that, right? So this is what I mean, right, about, and then of course we got the Black Lives Matter people countering the counter-protesters, right? And then now we have a discourse, right, a very intense, heated discourse that leads to people being killed, because eventually you find out what right-wing folks are really about, right, in terms of violence, which goes back to the conference, okay? Now, I mentioned my work. This recent book came out last year where I was able to bring together me and Ron, who teaches at Baylor. We were able to bring together scholars to look at global dimensions of African-American struggle. And so it is this pathway that brings me these conferences, right, these other scholars. So we were able to put it together and put an edited collection that we looked at the role of Harriet Douglass, others in the 19th century. I've been fascinated by the abolition movement. I study social and political movements, so I'm not as bound traditionally by like 19th century, 20th century. So I teach courses that, you know, my focus is on social movements. But I'm fascinated by the abolition movement because you see, you know, as you know, in this sort of image here on the left, which was a common sort of wood carving, the ways in which artistic presentation of slavery traveled around the world. These woodcuts, right? Sort of, you know, people would use them to stamp them on things. And then on the right, you have, this is an image from Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was, you know, one of the biggest novels of the 19th century in terms of sales, right? Britain, the sales in Britain are part of what made it such a major novel in terms of sales, right? Now, the problem, though, when you look at that, has to do with this question of representation. Okay, so when you look immediately at the first image on the left, there is the supplicant, right? You have the enslaved person on their knees. Am I not a man and brother, right? Sort of, you know, almost begging those of power for some sort of liberty. In this case, it'd be sort of whites that aren't slaveholders, but the effort to persuade them just through that image, right? For abolitionists at the time, particularly black abolitionists, for historians and activists this day, they have a problem with that image, right? That sort of idea of the supplicant as opposed to other images of African Americans that would seem, you know, to represent Nat Turner, for example, right? And represent something that they see as more positive, but also reflecting the mood of black Americans, right? Which was very much, you know, towards this idea of agency and change, as opposed to being passive. And similar things can be seen in Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, right? The sight of the auction should horrify you, right? And that's why one should be against, you know, slavery and enslavement, right? As opposed to just the reality of just it's slavery. I mean, we shouldn't have to represent it these ways. One should see that and understand how horrible it is without, you know, focusing on the quintessential mother with their baby, for example, which is oftentimes used. Literally in my community in Western Mass, Sojourner Truth lived, and for a period of time, and so we have the abolitionist tradition. This is like 5 minutes from my house, actually, the statue. And after Rodney King, in 92, 93, there began a movement in Northampton to try to represent this abolitionist legacy in the history of sort of African Americans in Western Mass. That led to a committee. 7 years later, by about 2000, they've raised the money. They've, you know, and they present this sculpture to Sojourner Truth as a living testimony to bring children for schools, right, to come to the space and to fill it with an artistic representation, right? Art as a site for conversation, Okay, and so you literally see this in my community, and I'm involved in work with the David Ruggles Center. David Ruggles is a black abolitionist who lived also in Western Mass and was a part of the abolitionist movement. And so this education still happens today, and I'm sort of involved with others in that. Frederick Douglass cared very much about his image, very much, right? And people talk about him being one of the most photographed and drawn people of the 19th century. Because he knew the power, right, of image, okay? And so you see many images and paintings of Douglass because he was not only an iconic figure, but he also knew, before the age of Instagram, right, the important role of representation, right? So Douglass wants to make sure you see him, not just read his words, right? And so Douglass becomes a fascinating figure for that. Douglass's image and the narrative took him on tours to Ireland, to England, right, to Europe, where he traveled around and lectured for hours about slavery, right, because he was once enslaved, right? And so now the book, the image, comes off the page, and here you have an actually enslaved person standing before you testifying to the power of enslavement, how bad it is, right? And so Douglass becomes a really important figure because these places in Europe, particularly Belfast, Northern Ireland, they're going to have murals and monuments to Douglass's trip there, right? And that's going to come on the heels of social movements. Now, Douglass's statue in Rochester, New York was actually one of the first major monuments to a figure in the 1890s in the United States, okay? Around the same time, there's the Massachusetts 54th, the movie Glory. I don't know if we saw Glory back in the day, but that's in Boston Commons also, okay? But in terms of representations, Douglass gets a statue like this downtown. Still a predominantly white city, first of all, we got to realize Rochester was, back in this time. So it was a big deal to have Douglass standing as he did downtown, right? What's interesting is when I was on my way to Toronto, I stopped because I wanted to see it. This is what I do, right? These talks and stuff. And I actually couldn't find it. The GPS took me this exact location, but it's like now a baseball stadium. So I'm like in the parking lot, like, what's going on? Like, where's Douglass, right? Where is this representation? And it's ironic because the demographics of Rochester, some of us know, has very much changed, right? And so now you have Rochester as a place that has, a very large black community. But this Douglass I went to find, is not there. Right? It's sort of been taken off the landscape, visual landscape. But moved, it's a picture of my kids with me at the statue, to this park. Like, I got to give them a little run. I talked about Amani earlier. And now there's so many ways it's problematic for us, right? So we got Douglass downtown, representing this sort of black iconic figure. Then he disappears. He's in this park. You see the trees? You gotta park your car, walk in, walk up, stage, and then you find Douglass, right? So we've removed Douglass from the public space, right? So we don't take down the statue like they did Robert E. Lee. We move it to a place you gotta kind of stare at the thing to find. And for me, I'm sort of interested in this sort of somewhat of an erasure of Douglass's power, right? When you see him downtown, you come into the city versus drive around, find the park the car, go in, look around, and find Douglass in the park, right? You also have this, there's actually more than one Douglass statue in Rochester. You see the power of Douglass by the way people respond to his presence. If you notice, we don't have Douglass in this image, right? Because people responded to the activism Black Lives Matter after George Floyd in 2020. And these individuals' response, we don't know who they were. I don't know, didn't follow the case. Their response was to take down the Douglass statue, was to remove it from the public space as a way to represent their anger, their frustration with what's happening. I mean, is it coincidence? July 2020, right? This is right after all the stuff was going on. You see Douglass defaced, broken, removed. And actually, I have a whole bunch of throughout. You saw the graffiti and John Brown said KKK and written on it, right? So it's fascinating how our figures in African life become the site where people express their anger towards this, right? They may not express it by being counter demonstrators, but they might express it by in the nighttime going and breaking a statue or graffiti on it, right? So we see this happening in this contestation. Now, I'm going to actually just skip past this because I want to talk about Harriet Tubman. Now, Tubman's an interesting figure because Harriet Tubman, again, also very much managed her image, did an excellent job of that. She earned it. She certainly earned it. But in this case, there was an artist named Michael Alowitz was commissioned, he's actually a white artist, was commissioned to do a mural of Harriet Tubman in Baltimore. Now, some of us been to Baltimore, we know about Baltimore, and he was commissioned by mostly black organizations. And so when he was commissioned to do the mural, he showed them this final print, and people had a problem with it. Right? They said, well, do we really want Harriet Tubman with a gun, Baltimore gun violence? Is this something we want to represent? Now, as an artist, though, as you can see the title, Tubman was known to carry a gun, right? And so the question goes back to this idea of contestation over history and memory. How do we want to remember Tubman versus the historical Tubman? Right, this will be historically accurate for having the gun. But does the community want Tubman to be remembered that way, right? And so this leads to a lot of friction between artists and the community. In this situation, it reverses it because you have a black community, sort of commissioning this that's frustrated or is uncertain and uncomfortable with representation of Tubman this way, even when accurate, even when perhaps inspiring to some people, right, to see sort of this black woman represented in this way, right? Now, one of the most famous examples, and right, I had to do it, right, put it on you for Coach Woods.
I was wondering if it was going to make a PowerPoint. I was sitting there
I had to do it.
earlier in Virginia, and I was like, oh, don't do it.
Got it. No, we got it. No, it's an important story. And Coach, I think part of what's important, I was fortunate because one of my students at Clark actually moved to New Orleans. She was one of my honor students. And so she was working for sort of public organizations. And so she was like one of the two white sort of students who were involved with the Take It Down, No Low movement, grassroots movement to remove this, right? And so she sort of talked to me about like what it was like to sort of be and watch this grassroots movement be, how should we say, appropriated by the mayor and suddenly becomes about a white mayor who's like, we gotta take down these monuments and memorials and we gotta remove them. And suddenly we lose the activists who spent all this time like, take it down, take it down. The narrative on the news is the courage of the mayor. Now I say it's not courageous, right? But the story switches to the mayor and his courage to take it down, and they had to put on the jackets. They had to do it at night because people threatened to kill. I'll kill anyone who takes it down, right? And so, part of what I'm interested in is the history and memory and the contestation, but I'm also interested in the way social movements, grassroots social movements, compel, force, pressure politicians to make hard decisions, right? Do you remember some of that at all? What was the word on the street when you were there, or was it?
New Orleans is a big. It has a lot of complex history, but this was particular just because it's actually a big route with all the Mardi Gras parades. So you had that whole tradition and culture people didn't want to let go of.
Yep.
But to your point about the mayor kind of instilling the thunder, if you will. Sorry.
It's because of the tape.
To your point about the mayor instilling the thunder, it definitely made those people who had put in a lot of that work, and then you put in work and you want to kind of see the results, and then to not get the credit. It got the purpose done, but then the larger issue, the schools, the streets, and then where does it stop? But that was definitely a big point of contention, if you will.
See, now you can go tell them that I made sure I represented, right? Because people will go in and this will be, they'll sort of end up perpetuating that narrative, that story of, the sort of, and it goes back to the abolition movement actually, right? The sort of white abolitionists and others sort of being benevolent and, they're so great for standing, up for African American rights, right? And you miss the social movement dynamic, right? So.
And point two, I think, as people are doing activism, though it seems like nothing's going to get accomplished. Well, something did get accomplished, so because of their work and their pressure, everybody ended up at the same route. Right? We were trying to get here together, we just took different ways, and I think the people in position of power are listening more than we think that they are. And it was
Excuse me.
credit sometimes where it's you, but you're being heard. It's just a matter of how persistent and resilient you can stay to get the message across.
Yeah, and oftentimes, talking to students all over, I always try to find the grad students, undergrads, wherever I'm at, whatever university, you usually don't know how close you are to winning. And that's the hard part of social media. You usually don't know that they're like this close to folding, right, and giving in to what you want, and they're holding that front. And so you gotta press on and keep pressing on because they're this close, and then if you just push on, then all right, what do you want? And they usually give in, right? After first trying other sorts of things. So trust me, they're always going to try to do other things before they give in. Because this is not a small thing for the mayor to take this down, right? So, but one of the things that's really important, and I don't know how much you were involved in this, Coach, but there's alternatives, right? Because part of the question is when you remove something, what do you put there instead, right? So there are many efforts to create other monuments and memorials for African Americans in New Orleans. But the Paper Monument Project is a great, innovative way to do it. So, this project, really briefly, I'm not going to read all that, but I just put up on the website. But their goal is to actually pair artists with historians to create, and you could see, let me just go forward actually for a second. You can see some of them up there, to put up these paper monuments in locations and sites where historic events happened, right? As an alternative to just trying to raise all the money to have a Sojourner Truth statue. Like it took us 7 years in Northampton, and it's really tough. But there are alternatives. And you could actually go on your phone, and they have a little website, and it can be continuous, right? So it's not just, it's there for a while, and then if anyone wants to do something else, they sort of can be a part of the Paper Monument Project, right? So it's just more examples of how it can be represented. I grabbed a few of these when I was there. The bookstores have the printed versions to put up other places, right? Now, I talked a bit about this sort of throughout, this idea of counter memory, right? So part of the role is to be represented. So to have a Sojourner Truth statue or a Douglass statue or these paper monuments, different figures. But there's also an aspect that serves as a counter memory, right? So in other words, to challenge the ways in which people attempt to remember the past in romanticized ways. And so that's another way art and murals do. They try to provide a counter memory. And there's very few organizations globally that have had such an impact on sort of countering a sort of idea of America as the Black Panther Party. I mean, there is, hands down. And the reason why, as I'm going to argue, has to do with youth. We forget that Black Panther Party was primarily a youth movement. Young people, right? From college age, early 20s down to high school. That was the primary people that were joining the chapters and being involved. I mean, Huey and stuff, they weren't even that old. I mean, they're like 25, 26 when they started off anyway, right? But it really was a youth movement. And when you look at these images, the Panthers, you can see, these are teenagers. These are young people, right, who make up a lot of them. The image of the Black Panthers global, right? When I was gonna, we were talking, I was saying that when I was in Italy, I bought this CD of this Italian rap group called Frontal Assault. And on the cover, it was like had like a Black Panther symbol. And I was like, I gotta buy it, just to physically have a CD, but also to see that art, right? That's a whole nother talk, right? Just music and these different organizations and how they continue to inspire people. Part of what the Panther art did was constantly to try to provide a counter narrative at the time, right? To counter the idea, in this case, of African American women who were, maybe poor, by showing, they have a gun in this case, showing the revolutionary potential, right? This is a long tradition that goes back to the early 19th century, and it goes back to even those wood carvings, right? Abolition movement, this effort to provide a counter narrative at the time. But it also offered people like Emory Douglas, who's the artist in this case, the Panthers, who his work was in this periodical Black Panther, with a place to have his art done. He didn't go to art school, right? He got put on at like 16 in the Panthers, and they go, you do painting, you do drawings? Why don't you do some drawings for us, right? Now Emory Douglas is like an iconic artist. They did a whole thing at the Met of his different art from back in, because back then, like, that ain't art. Those posters, that's not art, right? And you just keep doing your work. And 40 years later, he's all up in all the big art galleries and see it as a very important art, even though, people question the artistic merits. Do people know about this whole thing? This whole tell us about it. Where's the mic? Pass the mic over. About the idea of why a work like this or this would not be considered art. What are they going to say?
Well, there's a large, there's this revelation
Yep.
in the white art community in the 70s that black people make art.
That's right.
The art we make is actually art. And I think it's a sort of de-weaponization of what we do, in the sense that if you say it's not art,
Yep.
you say it's not influential, you say it's not part of the culture.
Yep.
But when you look at the effects,
Mm.
when you see him making books with Colin Kaepernick,
Yep.
and what the Black Panther Party means to the world,
Yep.
it's obviously art.
Yep.
Even
Yep.
if it wasn't trying to be art, it's art.
Yep.
And I think that is part of how dominant cultures put movements down.
Okay. Yep. Particularly by keeping them outside the doors of the museum, right? That becomes an effective way to try to be a gatekeeper and define what is art. And a lot of this art propaganda, right? The idea is that, well, this is more propaganda. This isn't real art. Real art captures aesthetic beauty and doesn't attempt to move people. That's what right? It's like that.
But W.B. Du Bois would say everything propaganda.
There you go. Thank you. Art, propaganda, art, go 20s, right?
Right.
So it's a long debate. But what is clear, the evidence to answer itself, that people like Emory Douglas are now very much seen as, important figures, and they have sort of had a pathway to it. This, to sort of go back to this group, Afro Cobra in Chicago, a collective of visual artists who began to come together, because visual art, as you know, maybe you do painting and stuff, but it's sort of, painting indoors, etc. The idea of murals, it wasn't always something even conscious black artists were sort of involved in. And when they were, some of them did works that were abstract, right, or collage type things, right, as opposed to sort of these, as you can see with the Wall of Respect, very clearly see Malcolm here is the obvious one, and other art, sort of figures from the past represent outside, and most importantly, bringing the community to participate in the construction of the mural, right? So that becomes an important part of this movement. It's not just sort of the beauty of it and also sort of pride and creating narratives on the wall. There's so much happening on this wall in terms of stories being told, right? But also involving the community, kids and others involved in creating and beautifying the community, right? So that becomes a very much important part of these collectives like Afro Cobra, that are going to go on and become art teachers. Nelson Stevens is one of my professors who was a member, he ended up being in Western Mass at UMass, and so I had a chance to sort of hear from him and him talk about his work and the importance of that. One of the most recognizable figures, in the struggle is Malcolm, and those of us who lived through the 90s saw a real return, right? And this is why I brought up the sort of the rap groups from the 80s and 90s in Italy, a real return to position oneself, right, on the cover in a way that represents the iconic image of Malcolm, right, that goes back to the 60s, right? And so you see this intergenerational conversation. Say it again, in the mic though, in the mic. Yeah.
I said even Fresh Prince of Bel-Air.
Yeah, tell us about it. Tell us about that.
There's this whole episode where sort of your intergenerational
Yeah.
Phil and Will are arguing about what Malcolm X means to them. And I feel like that's just evidence to what you were saying.
Yeah, no, all good. No, it's absolutely the case. And what became interesting with hip hop is the fact that that era of Public Enemy, I'll never forget, I was a freshman in college when Public Enemy was on Saturday Night Live. And they did this song, I don't know if I was like 92. They did Can't Trust It. Slave ships. They came in with the slave ships on. And I was like, oh my God, I don't know if public television is ready for this. Because back in those days, for the younger people, Saturday Night Live or, these shows, still live TV, and they didn't bring like rap artists on it to bring Public Enemy on, to have them play Can't Trust It. Those who were watching, play that song. So those slave ships and everything is an example about that moment and how important returning to the past really was. It goes away, it comes back, in terms of thinking about the history of hip hop. But definitely KRS-One was one of the central figures, who for a long time my students didn't know anything about him. But then more recently, your students, young people know KRS-One now. But there was a time in the 2000s when, rap had gone a different direction, and KRS-One was just not known. They were like, oh yeah, I don't know who that is. But nowadays, KRS-One, other conscious rappers are back. All right, I want to talk about the Panthers. I just want to sort of take this further. So I mentioned the Panthers globally, and so let me just sort of go forward and talk about Afro-Indian collaboration. We were talking about the book Cast. So people are often surprised. Isabel Wilkerson wrote this book Cast, a very, very famous, big book right now. But the analogy of the way in which racism in the United States, the way it stifles Black Americans, is like a caste, like in India. That analogy actually goes back, a long way, right, to the early 20th century. Du Bois, others, they use that framework, right? It's not a new framework. And specifically, Gerald Horne wrote this great book about Afro-American solidarity. That cover is Martin Luther King when he was in India. But the Afro-Asian solidarities were in earnest, particularly in the 50s and 60s, right? And so you really saw that representation. And so by the time you get to the early 70s and the Delete Panthers emerge, right, these young people, again, youth movement, okay, they're inspired by the Panthers, and then they end up representing their idea. And so you notice in this imagery from the magazine, the tiger, instead of the panther, right? Right? So there's a translation we were talking about that goes on, right? As different groups of people globally take on these figures. They may take on the Panther name, but it needs to represent the local community sort of ideas of what's ferocious, what really can represent our group in a way that would make people fear us and represent the power we have, even if we're people in the community, we're delete, we're seen as untouchables, and in society we're seen as being below people, right? We're going to represent that power. And it becomes a really important sort of youth movement. In Israel, right, people aren't aware, right, of the importance of the sort of Panther movement in Israel, right? 71 march, there's a march, Stop Poverty March, right? This idea, as you can see on there, of people who were Jewish in North Africa, other places, really young people being captivated by the Panthers, right? And the ways in which that sort of challenged the state, that sort of image. In New Zealand, right, Polynesian Panthers, yeah. I actually was at a conference where I was sort of the chair of a panel where a scholar, this is some years ago, 2013, so it was really early research on the influence of the Panthers in New Zealand. So this scholar presented, and I was like, oh shoot, I didn't know about that. So I went and researched that for this, for my work. But you see this sort of representation and the importance of the youth movement, right? It really is something that really captivates. And so now, Black Lives Matter, you see these people, and again, it's also about biorhythm, like sort of like 40 years later, there's all these retrospects about these groups. So they're now in their 60s and 70s, and so there was an exhibit at a gallery of Polynesian Panthers, and so they're really sort of returned to the public eye. These issues haven't gone away in some cases, even if there's been improvement, and so therefore the representation becomes important. All right. Now, I want to talk about some of the murals. So one of the more powerful experiences I had recently was going to Belfast, Northern Ireland. My PhD student is from Northern Ireland. I was stunned when we sort of got the application. He said, I want to work with Professor Power-Greene. He's from Belfast. And I say, what? This young guy from Belfast will come work with me? It's wild. And I told him, I said, one day when I'm in Europe, he was back, he finished the course, I'm going to come find you. So I was presenting at a conference, and I said, I looked at the flight, the price, I was like, I'm coming out for 2 days. I called him, I said, I'm coming out. And so I flew out to Belfast. It was inexpensive because I was in Europe already. And Matthew took me down either the infamous Falls River Road, those that study Irish, sort of the Troubles as they call them, the contestation in Northern Ireland more recently. And this place, Falls River Road, has incredible wall art. And so we walked the whole thing. Man, it was great. And so we captured things, such as this, sort of, looking at their struggle and how that's represented on the walls. There are the smaller images of the struggle in even neighborhoods of people that died during the contestation, sort of the police, people caught in crossfires. And when you get to the end of Falls River, it's a long, sort of long road. You get to the Freedom Fighter Wall, which is incredible. Now, you get all the way down the wall, and who we find up in Io? We find Frederick Douglass represented, right? Representing a different moment, a different movement, but capturing that same, the zeitgeist, right? The spirit of the day, the fight for human rights, the fight for racial justice, right? He ain't alone, though, on the Freedom Fighter Wall, right? Who we got? We got Sarah Truth, right? She gets the run, right, to be presented on the wall, right? We got Rosa Parks. Thank you, Miss Rosa, right? From a different movement, but represented on the wall, right? And so, and on this wall, actually, there's, all different sort of solidarity movements, they're presented on the wall. But it's part of this global conversation about utilizing art, murals, graffiti, in order to educate communities, right? People who may not even know anything about Frederick Douglass, but then find themselves in class reading the narrative, right? Maybe they're, Northern Ireland, maybe they're in school, and they say, wait, I see that, I know Frederick Douglass. I know Frederick Douglass. I know that image, they say, right? And you find that relationship. And so this is part of why this sort of theory I have that I've been working on about intellectual geography, right? The ways in which our ideas, right, the way we think about ourselves and other people are influenced by our walking space when we pass monuments and memorials, right? And so we see a monument memorial to Robert E. Lee, and we're 7, and then we're 13. What are we going to think about our ideas about us, our past and history, right? They know that. That's exactly why it's there, right? That's exactly why during the 50s, during a child segregation, is the big moment where you see some of these put up. Because the other people know that too. And they want to make sure that the representation of their idea about the past is all over. And so this is where we get this idea of counter memory, right? How you counter memory. Paper monument projects, murals, graffiti, things that don't cost a whole lot of money to be raised, right? But we can see that, and we do see that. We see this image of Malcolm, which was put up, and then taken down. Put up in 2002, but ended up being taken down because it was seen as something that was provocative and sort of trying to continue the tensions, right, between the loyalists and other folks who want to be independent, right? So even Malcolm as the centerpiece can be seen, by some as being too much contestation, over him. When I was in Paris, I don't know if people know this, it's new. A lot of people don't know this, but there's a Rosa Parks station stop now in Paris. And so this is me standing, and so inside there's this incredible mural to Rosa Parks, which has so many of these different images of the movement and everything, all inside the station stop. Again, you're in Paris, right? You're a young kid, you walk by this every day, Rosa Parks. Where should we meet? We're meeting at the Rosa Parks station stop, right? Meet me over by that mural. You may not even know anything about the history, who Rosa Parks, but what happens, right? It plants that seed. And then later on, oh yeah, Rosa Parks. I know Rosa Parks. I know Rosa Parks. I know that image. I'm connected to that image is a part of my growing up experience. Think about that as French young people saying that, right? We need more of that around here, right? We need some of us saying that. I know young kids. I know Rosa Parks, right? And this is what the potential is, right? If we look at how art and activism. Now, as I mentioned, I'm in Germany. Black Lives Matter. I'm jumping off, right? I was in Mainz, Germany at that conference I mentioned. I was sitting right like this with graduate students, and they were telling me about racial resistance and the ways in which people really don't like them challenging, them challenging the reality of racism on their campus in Mainz, right? This question of, are you real German? Now these young people, their parents immigrated from Ghana, right, in the 70s and 80s. So they were born in Germany, right? Black as me, born in Germany, speak German, right? Family from Ghana, right? So what does it mean to be German, right? And so this is what the Black Lives Matter looks like, particularly in Germany and where I was in Mainz. It's about identity, about representation, right? And the pushback is real. In Dublin, it was huge. I mentioned being in Northern Ireland. In Paris, it was huge. This is the image of Paris, right? We can't breathe, right? Okay. And then you see throughout images, once George Floyd hit off, again, almost immediately you see artists presenting. This image was the one that was in, I'm totally blanking on it right now. This one is these Syrian artists did this in Syria, right? Immediately catching up and people following the whole entire trend. It becomes a part of wall art all over, right? It's fascinating to think about, how these artists are inspired and what the conversation this creates for people who feel oppressed all over the world, right? It's fascinating. Now, Malcolm X continues. People, this is a British London group. They're not playing. They're like this, called the Malcolm X Movement, right? It's a few years ago established. I use this image because Twitter and Instagram, the other post we had was from Instagram, these become the new digital sites for this. Even when they say no to you in the mural. Because of the digital revolution on Twitter and Instagram, these images are circulating thousands of times. The art, you may put a little mural over here like they did in Syria, and it's circulating, right? And so Twitter and Instagram become another site where the imagery and people and artists are able to capture it. And also you can use it for contestation, as they do in this case, right? Black and Asian solidarity, right? As they say in normal times anymore, it's not enough, right? They have film festival. Yeah, this is the one they're getting on Italy and challenging them, etc. All right, I'm going to open it up, but I just want to end and remind people that, as I said, the contestation goes on, right? Right? And so, and this one is from Seattle. People also use the site to counter the counter narrative, right? And so there's a discourse happening, right, between those that really see these moments as moments that inspire. This really huge second, Michael Brown, sort of Trayvon Martin, 2012. Michael Brown really got that mass movement going in 2014, 2015. Student activism was off the chart. Things, up and down. Donald Trump's elected, and by 2020, we see that second huge wave of activism and wall art going on, and that's why we got a lot of the George Floyd murals, but also the counter image, right? That people have in efforts to try to erase this image. So, I'll stop there. Thank you all for being attentive and listening. Let's have conversations. People's thoughts. I want to sort of go back to freedom fighter wall. Yeah, thoughts, comments. Yeah. You just gotta grab the mic. Hmm?
I think this is really dope. I think your work is very cool.
Thank you.
And I share your beliefs in a lot of ways. I'm an event producer,
Yep.
and I was doing research for a Juneteenth event last year, and I was reading 400 Souls by Ibram X. Kendi.
Okay, yeah.
And one thing that really struck me was how Lincoln just didn't free the slaves. Lincoln had no choice but to free the slaves or lose the war.
Yeah.
And I think in a lot of ways, the abolition as like, oh, this movement was won,
Yep.
and they were successful because they earned their own liberty.
Yep.
And I guess sort of like going full circle, how do you feel like that perspective is internationally?
It's a great question. One of the, I'm hesitating because it's not a question I've asked people. You know what I mean? And so I'm not sure, that's the answer, about the outside the academy. See my point? So in the academy, the debates, the sort of rethinking the abolition movement, Lincoln, that's a part of the history. So, that's common. People understand and agree with the idea of this framing of Lincoln as the savior. That's been challenged. Most books that come out, this book comes out about Lincoln every day, probably. Lincoln's the most written about subject. Most written about subject in U.S. history, right, is the Civil War, second's Lincoln, or vice versa, one of the two, right? So, right, but most scholars who study abolition movement, so I'm not sure what they think outside. But what I do know is that from the Freedom Fighter Wall as an example, I don't see Lincoln globally. I don't see Lincoln globally on walls. So that may speak to how artists, community people, don't find the inspiration in Lincoln, even though, he's a person, a politician that was put in a very difficult situation. And the big argument is, he changed and all this, that, and the third. But the reality is that the romanticization of sort of Lincoln as a savior figure is not one that's very big. So. Other thoughts, even other people, just comments or questions, anything.
I just thought it was intriguing.
You just want to pass the mic.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. Let's pass it around.
I just thought it was intriguing how.
There you go.
Oh gosh.
I know that's like,
I just thought it was intriguing how movements that would start here in America that obviously are very personal to us.
Yep.
Whether you're black, white, whatever. How it makes this reach across, and I love the concept of art because you're almost. I wouldn't say forced to keep the conversation going, but what I like about it is it can go at your own pace and what you're comfortable with. Sometimes I think as we try to kind of move this conversation forward, people feel like, oh, you're just throwing my face. Well,
Yep.
you walk down, it's a conversation piece.
Mhm.
You can have either history right there on whatever piece of art, or obviously people that you have to do with. So I think it's pretty fascinating and such a way that can make it digestible for everybody. I feel like art and sports are usually two things that music that
Yep.
kind of combines people, right? You can make it whatever sport or interest that you have. So I think it's a fascinating research. So I'm definitely going to look for your book.
yeah, and I want to say that that actually, and all artists sort of know this. They're aware that the power of their work, right? So their work in of itself can be flat, right? It can just be, not understood, not, maybe appreciated or sort of. But the love, the goal is to do exactly what you said. And this is where we get to the art versus propaganda, right? I mean, if your goal is only to persuade people, okay, well, that's something. It's artistic. That's something, right? But when you think about the conversation it generates, now we start to get to sort of something that's artistic because it's not so certain. And I do believe that even, profiles or even, very simple portraits, you think about Mona Lisa. Go tell me that's not art, right? Even if it's a simple image, the image of George Floyd, that can be artistic, right? And so I agree with that, and I think that those that are going to interpret how they're going to interpret, and it's us, it's us that gets that comment. The artist said it, they're done. Now it's how we interpret it, what we do, right? So, what about some of y'all thoughts? Yeah, whichever direction you want to go. I'd love to hear people's impressions or what it conjures up. We got one over here next. We'll pass it around then.
Thank you.
Yep.
I think this is super fascinating, and I really appreciate the pictures too. I think I'm really happy that you shared the visual examples of everything you're sharing. And as a linguist, I was just caught by what we were talking about earlier in terms
Yep.
of translating movement, translating meaning rather.
Yep.
And in linguistics, there's this concept of linguistic relativity and the idea that meaning is assigned based on the way people use language. And
Yep.
it's going to change based on culture everywhere you go in the world. And so seeing a panther turn into a tiger, that's necessary.
Yep.
Because that's meaningful in a different part of the world, right? And so I think that part I found to be extremely fascinating, and how kind of the essence, the intention, the inspiration is carried on a global scale, but translated so that it is digestible, relevant, and meaningful without compromising where it came from and why, and what it's intended to do as a social movement, a social justice movement, as a way to connect people. And I also really liked you talking about these as counter memories and
Cool.
thinking about that relating to counter stories and critical race theory.
Yep, that's it.
And challenging what counts as memory and whose memory. And I think, to your point of why we don't see Lincoln globally, I've been to Italy, I never saw Lincoln painted anymore in
Yeah.
Syria. That's not the memory that is meaningful.
Yep.
And what happened after Lincoln was not enough. Lincoln didn't do the work after, but
Yeah, but still,
but
yeah.
that's not the memory that needs to be told, that inspires movements.
Yep.
Clearly, otherwise we would see different paintings, I think, in different murals. So I think this is super fascinating. I have some other mural project I wanted to share with you that
Yep.
my colleague at UC Davis is working on along the border in Tijuana,
Okay.
using like the digital world, right? And I'm sure other artists have done this, but QR codes
Yeah.
on like paper project murals.
Yep.
To actually then hear the story of the person that you're seeing on the mural.
Brilliant.
So it's just really awesome. Really, really great. And I would love to take your thoughts.
Yeah, and actually, no, I did a class on Black Power, the Black Lives Matter movement for that exact reason. I just came up with it because students, it's tangential, like the connections between the Black Power movement and Black Lives Matter. And once it seems so obvious that there's connections, but it's like, but how? Like, what does that fist mean? What does a Panther logo mean? Like, who were the Black Panther Party, right? Who was Malcolm X? Like, they see the images, but it requires more, right? It requires, talking about the contradictions and all the messy stuff of movements too, and not just sort of glamorize or romanticize it. But yeah, what else?
I have to step out after
Yep.
I made this comment. But
Yeah.
I liked what you were saying about how in like places like Germany, a big
Yep.
discussion is being had about what does it mean to be German.
Yep.
Because I have a friend she's French and she's really white.
Yep.
But her cousin he's from Ethiopia.
Yep.
Like I think that's Ethiopia, and he's brown, but he's French as well.
Yep.
Or like I have two younger brothers who have the same father, but their mother is German,
Mhm.
and they're living in Germany now.
Okay.
They speak German and everything.
Yeah.
I look at them and I wonder, like, how are they going to fit themselves into all of this,
Mhm. Well, and my response is always the same response, which is that, we imagine ourselves, how we understand ourselves as Black people, right? And the challenge that every social movement has is in deciding if you're going to be, how you imagine Blackness. Is it an inclusive global Black identity, right? Or are we going to police boundaries, right? This is a major question in every social movement, how we police boundaries. So yeah, it is. It's something that's serious. And what's interesting about, I don't know if people have been abroad, been involved in these conversations, but in Germany, it's like, I feel like some of what the students of color are dealing with is almost like the 70s here. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's literally. And so when I was at this, I was at this conference, and the grad students were like, we need to challenge, because of Black representation. I was like, wow, I'm like sitting in like a formative graduate meeting. Like, it's like 2016, but for them, right? Like, it was like, this is the one with the challenge. Even though it was the American Studies Conference in Germany, like, they feel like it's more than just that race is important for them to challenge among the conference goers, right? And so, again, I think that this is an evolving process, and each community and each individual needs to decide their sense of identity. You know what I mean? And people, Africanness is broad. Always has been. If you live in New Orleans, right? Particularly in the South. People live in the North don't understand how diverse we are. How we look, we have red hair. We're so diverse. But when you live in the Northeast, it's like, it's so much more, I feel like, at least. When you're down South, you really have a greater sense of diversity of Black people.
Did you share about your book? The new book.
Yeah. So I have a novel coming out in the fall that is about that imagines a black woman philosopher named Allie Douglas who's kidnapped by this white supremacist who is trying to start this revolution. And she writes on white supremacy, and so she's like a philosopher. So it's like this idea of imagine what would happen if you're an academic. And so it's the intellectual's worst nightmare, where like suddenly you become on the other side, right? You're writing about it a detached way as a philosopher, but then all of a sudden you become on the other side, and you're now captured with the other women who he has captured. And it's not theoretical. And he wants her to take his confessions. It's not theoretical anymore. Now she's like in the lion's den, right? And so I started working on that novel in 2008, actually, when Obama was elected, actually. And that's when I began to imagine. I've been writing on this stuff for a long time, but I really started imagining, sort of what it would mean to white people, this idea of a black president. And it got me going and got me thinking about stuff that horrified me growing up in the 80s, the Atlanta child murders, for example. And sort of, which people had said back then in the late 70s, 80s, that it was like white supremacists had been kidnapping young black kids. And as a kid growing up, that was like, I remember it was like a horrifying moment when the horror movies you watch suddenly become a part of that. And so all of that fit into me working on this novel. I write fiction too, I've written 3 novels. This is actually the first one that's going to be published. But it sort of incorporates all of the work I've been doing and around social movements and fear. Really, is fear and the ways in which fear can galvanize communities. And in this case, it brings the black community of Birmingham, Alabama, together to find the girls and to find Allie Douglas, this philosopher, ends up being kidnapped as well. And because it's always beyond the individual horrifying act with these people. Right? They always have some bigger vision, that they're going to do, and they imagine this romanticized past. And so, it's coming out other press in the fall. I'm looking forward to what I'm calling my Black Minds Matter tour, where I'm going to be coming around to communities, Denver, come through. We're going to bring the intellectuals, the artists together, have an authentic pairing of academics, artists, and community folk in order to show that the silos that exist don't need to be. We collapse the difference between artists and activists and whatnot. So that's the goal. So that's coming up for the fall. So.
Thank you. Give them a hand.
All right.
And
thank you.
Forward to next year coming back. We're going to come back bigger and better with, as you said, with the whole Black Minds.
Black Minds Matter. Black Minds Matter. They really do.
Thank you for coming out.
All right. I appreciate it.